Hello, everyone. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the director of the GPS Parent Series. Thrilled about today's program. It was more than a year ago, I think, I had a conversation with Dr. Brewer, and I knew this was a date I was circling on my calendar in red ink because I didn't want to miss the opportunity to keep reminding you all those months because this is a very special event. I'm a huge fan of these books, and lots of people are here, and they're also fans as well. Quickly, I want to tell you about upcoming programs before we get into today's event. Next week, well, actually, this week on Thursday, Dr. Jason Klein, Dr. Ken Wallace will be in conversation about career planning, why before where, planning for the next generation. I know you'll be interested in that, parents. And again, our ask of everyone is to please share this resource. Everyone is here. These programs are free, no registration. So tell a friend, tell a neighbor, tell someone. October 9th. That'll be at noon and 7. And then the following week, Dr. David Yeager. I have a feeling, Dr. Brewer, you are aware of Dr. Yeager. He is a protege of Carol Dweck, who was with us many years ago. His book is called 10 to 25. We're calling it What We Get Wrong, Motivating and Communicating with Young People. That's October 15th, Wednesday at noon and 7 p.m. The following week, we will be talking we're really excited about our young child events. Even though we're a high school district, we know the importance of the early child. And so we'll be talking with Mary Sheedy for the first time. Her book, Raising Your Spirited Child, it is now out in its 5th edition. So come back on the 21st. And then we're always excited when we welcome Lisa D'Amour. She will be in conversation with Jennifer Wallace. Lisa is back with a new edition of her book, Untangled, The 7 Stages of Development, Girls and Boys. She'll be in conversation with Jennifer Wallace. Her book is called Never Enough. That's on Thursday, October 30th. That takes us through the end of the month. Again, please let someone know. I'm so excited about today's event. Delighted you're here, and so delighted my friend Dr. David Hill. He's the superintendent of Community Consolidated School District 93 to read the introductions. Take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Gilda. Dr. Brewer is a psychiatrist and internationally known expert in habit change, the science of self-mastery and mindfulness, training for treating anxiety, emotional eating, smoking, and other addictions. He is a director of research innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also serves as a professor in behavioral and social sciences at the School of Public Health and Psychiatry at the School of Medicine at Brown University. Previous, Dr. Brewer held research and teaching positions at Yale, the University of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He developed Mind Shift Recover, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting people suffering from addiction, has trained U.S. Olympic athletes, foreign government ministers, and corporate leaders. His work has been featured on 60 Minutes, The Wall Street Journal, The Today Show, Time, CNN, BBC, and more. His TED Talk has been viewed over 20 million times. He is the best-selling author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits, Unwinding Anxiety, New Science Shows How to Break the Cycles of Worry and Fear to Heal Your Mind, and The Hunger Habit. And we are delighted to welcome him to the GPS Parent Series today. Dr. Brewer?
Great. It's so great to be here with you all. Thank you for having me. Just to give a little bit of a run of show, I'll give a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation for about 45 minutes, but then would really love to open it up to questions and conversations so we can dive into this together. So I will go ahead and get started. All right. So if we think about, well, actually, let's just dive right in. I'm going to start with a story of a patient that was referred to me a couple of years ago, who is referred to me for anxiety. And I'm showing a picture of a car driving here because he also had been getting panic attacks when driving on the highway. In fact, he met all the criteria for panic disorder, all the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. And as he described his medical history to me, he had started getting panic attacks in 5th grade. So had panic and anxiety for a long time, had tried everything. Nothing worked. And here he was sitting in my office looking very anxious. So I just want to highlight 5th grade is interesting. If you look at when people start to acquire worry words, you can see that there's a bell curve here around the age of 10, right? So he's right within that bell curve of where we start to develop this taxonomy and this lived experience through our own languaging of our experience, in this case, anxiety. So what do I do for my folks who've started developing a vocabulary of anxiety since fifth grade, who've tried everything and are now, have generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder? Well, I try not to panic. And what I mean by that is that even the best medications out there, they about 1 in 5 patients show a significant reduction in symptoms with medications. So, there I'm basically playing the medication lottery and don't know, which of the next 5 patients is going to benefit and what to do with the rest of them, the other 80% who don't benefit. So, what else can we do besides medications? I like this cartoon because I have a black cat myself. But a lot of people don't have access to therapy. And honestly, there's a bell curve of therapists. And for anybody that's been in therapy, I'm sure they've noticed this, where some therapists are better than others. Therapy can be prohibitively expensive for some people, et cetera. So, and hard to scale. So we started asking this question, as me working in my clinic, how could I actually help people, develop evidence-based treatments, but also deliver them at scale? And it started with this question. I love this quote attributed to Einstein, where it says, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." And I bring this up because a lot of the approaches in modern day have been really focused on, cognitive approaches. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy. There are a lot of therapies that are think therapies, basically. And the problem here is that when you look from a neuroscientific standpoint, the medial prefrontal cortex seems to be where these are most associated. So where cognitive therapy seems to be acting the most. Again, not perfect studies for this, but it seems to indicate this. And importantly, also, the prefrontal cortex is the youngest and the weakest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. So it's the first that goes offline when we get stressed or anxious. So not necessarily the place we want to start when trying to work with anxiety. So for us, we took a step back and started asking, well, how much do we actually know about the brain? So I'm going to show you a 4-minute animation that we put together to kind of give you a neuroscience primer on how anxiety in the brain works. I'm going to switch here and hit play.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next, and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists race to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us, and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits.
Okay, so now that you all are neuroscience experts on how anxiety forms in the brain, we can really just break it down to the summary slide. This is called reinforcement or reward-based learning, oldest evolutionary process known in science. Eric Kandel even got the Nobel Prize showing that this is conserved all the way back to the sea slug. And this is set up with 2 flavors. One is positive reinforcement, where if there are pleasant things that arise out of our experience, we learn to repeat those. This is, for example, if we are hungry and we eat some berries and those berries have calories, our body and our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, remember this. On the other hand, the negative reinforcement side of things is when we see danger and we learn to avoid the danger, the reward is that we don't become somebody else's lunch. The problem here with anxiety is anxiety may be this evolutionary bottleneck where fear and planning come together. Think of anxiety as fear of the future. I love this quote from Tom Petty's song, Crawling Back to You. Most things I worry about never happen anyway, right? So how many of us can relate to this? Well, as I was struggling to help my anxiety patients in my clinic, I went back and looked at the literature, put on my neuroscience hat, and discovered something very profound. And I go through the history of this. I won't go into all of it. I wrote a Substack article on this a while ago that said something like, can anxiety be a habit? And there was a guy, Tom Borkovic, back in the 1980s, who wrote a 2-page paper suggesting that maybe anxiety could be driven through negative reinforcement. Now, of course, this got buried in the avalanche of press when Prozac came out. And so everybody was thinking, the promise of Prozac and blah, blah, blah. So unfortunately, that promise has been more, is not borne out as much as we were hoping. This is where these, 1 in 5 patients show significant benefit. But what Borkovic highlighted was really profoundly affected me. And so if we think of the feeling of anxiety being a trigger for the mental behavior of worrying, then this can lead to a negatively reinforced habit of anxiety because we feel it gives us this illusion of control, or it also helps us avoid the unpleasant feeling of emotion. And as anybody that's worried for a while knows, this reward starts to shrink and then worry just feeds back and drives more anxiety. So we get stuck in this loop. Here's an example from somebody in one of our programs that put it nicely. He said, I think of my to-do list or projects and conversations, I feel as though somehow the anxiety is trying to offer some control. In the same way, it developed to propel me out of procrastination, have me review a conversation to see that maybe I should have thought out the answer more clearly. I love the shoulds. There's this joke, we should all over ourselves, which doesn't help our anxiety. So what this suggests is that actually people know a lot about how anxiety works in the brain. And in fact, with this reinforcement learning mechanism, we can see all the different ways that this gets leveraged in society. So for example, the food industry, developing products that are designed to be addictive. And then also social media has gotten on board as well, where we are basically becoming these rats trained to collect levers. So don't go away. This is not just all bad news. For the last now 2 decades, my lab has been studying how habits form and how we can break them, and also how we can apply these methods to helping people with anxiety. And I use this cartoon of Waldo because it was not what we were expecting. And we started about 20 years ago just asking this question about this little known thing called mindfulness. Now it's very popular, but back then it was seen as a career killer because it was more rainbows and unicorns. John Kabat-Zinn actually put this concept forward in the West. He'd taken it back from some Eastern approaches, where he describes mindfulness as paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. He developed this well-known and well-researched program called mindfulness-based stress reduction back in the late 1970s at UMass Medical. And we said, okay, well, let's see if mindfulness can help. So when I started working on this, it was around the time that smartphones were just born. So 2010, I believe, was when the first iPhone was rolled out. I was at Yale at the time, and one of my mentors was studying how to put cognitive behavioral therapy online. And we said, well, I'd sit at the VA hospital in my clinic and look out at my window. We were on a smoke-free campus, and I'd see my patients out in the parking lot smoking and looking at their smartphones. So we said, well, my patients don't learn to smoke in my office. They don't learn to overeat in my office. They don't learn to get anxious in my office. Can I bring my office to them? And so we started developing apps for anxiety and for overeating and for smoking. And the idea was that we could give people trainings at their fingertips. We could make these short, very punchy didactics. At first, we started with mindfulness training. And then the idea was that we give people bite-sized pieces. We give them animations that drive key points home. And importantly, we can have in-the-moment exercises so people can work with their anxiety in the moment. Of course, as a scientist, I wanted to embed tools where we could actually measure to see how well this stuff worked. So I'm going to go through the next couple of slides quickly just to give you a sense of some of the science that we've done over the last decade or so with these digital therapeutics. And if you're interested in learning more details, I'm happy to send along any of the papers that we've published. So we started with our first study with the patient group that I thought would be really hard to work with, because if you can work with the worst of them, then it gets easier from there. So what's a population of individuals that doesn't take care of themselves and acts like martyrs? Oh, physicians. Yes, I can relate to that. So we actually did a study with anxious physicians. Unfortunately, there are way too many. It was very easy to recruit this group. And we did an open label trial, just meaning a single arm without a control group, just to see if we could get a signal, if people would use the program and benefit from it. And here we used a clinically validated scale called the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7 scale. 7 questions. The scoring is a little unclear for the general population because any score of 10 or above is consistent with a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. So here they just had to arbitrarily, break it into minimal, mild, moderate, and severe for 4 categories. But moderate is really pretty severe clinically. This is people with generalized anxiety disorder. And so we brought in people who met criteria for at least having a score of 10 or above. You can see these physicians excelled at having anxiety, as well as probably their studies and taking care of their patients. And what we found was within a month, we saw significant reductions. And within 3 months, our primary endpoint, we got a 67 or 57% reduction in anxiety. So that was really nice. It was a nice, good pilot study for us to get money from the for the institute formerly known as the NIH, um, to do a large randomized controlled trial in people with generalized anxiety disorder. And here we could bring in a control group, which was people getting usual clinical care. And here we saw something really remarkable. So first off, we saw with usual clinical care, we got about a 15% reduction in anxiety, which is right on par with about the 20%, 1 in 5 that you see with medication. So as people were getting treatment, they were getting better. But when you just added in this app-based mindfulness training program, we got a 67% reduction on average, and we got a 64% remission rate. So these folks were reporting basically no more anxiety. And here, this is just a fancy term for how many people you need to treat before one person shows a significant reduction in symptoms. With medications, it was 5.2. With our study, it was 1.6. So the smaller the number is better. Now, I'm going to skip through some of these details. We could look at the mechanism. We could figure out why people were getting better. And what we found was that people were learning to work with their emotions. This is really important. I call this distress tolerance. I actually wrote a Substack article on this a couple of weeks ago. But the idea is that we, as a society, when we have our phones and other weapons of mass distraction, as Cornel West puts it, we learn to avoid our experience rather than lean into it. And so the idea is, can we learn to re-lean, or can we relearn how to lean into our anxiety and be with those emotions? And in fact, people can do that, which leads to a reduction in worry, and reductions in worry lead to reductions in anxiety. And in fact, we took this one step farther. We could actually predict who benefited at baseline before people came in. And it seems like you'll see here in this next slide. So people with very bad anxiety did very well. People with moderate anxiety, still at the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, also did well. But here was a group in the middle that at baseline seemed to be experientially avoidant. So this goes with the distress tolerance piece. The more people were avoiding their experience, the less likely they were to benefit. So this helps us predict who might benefit, and also how to support the folks who might need better distress tolerance skills as they start a mindfulness training program. So all of this is to say, if we understand how the brain works, we can actually lean into that mechanism and use that mechanism to help us help people and help us change real world outcomes. So I'm just going to do this very, very briefly, but just want to highlight some of the neuroscience work that we've done as well. We've been spending 15 years looking at the brain and how it changes. I won't go into all of the details, but I just want to highlight two things. One is there's a brain network called the default mode network, or the DMN for short, and there are two hubs of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And these are shown in orange here because this study that was done over 10 years ago now showed that the more people worry, the more they activate these hubs of the default mode network. So the interesting thing about the default mode network is it's now been found to be a self-referential network. So when we think about ourselves, aka when we worry about the future, that's what this network is involved in doing. It's involved in thinking about ourselves in other ways as well, but this is just one example. I don't have a slide for this. This network also gets activated, especially the posterior cingulate cortex, the more adolescents get a bunch of likes on their Instagram feed. So you can kind of get a sense for it. It's not only the worry part, but it's also that excitement of, oh, me, somebody liked my post. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because even before that, we found when we looked at experienced meditators and we scanned their brains and compared them to people who had just learned to meditate that day that we put them in the scanner, there were very few differences in brain activity. But two of the big brain regions that showed differences were these two hubs of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And I'm showing them in blue here because experienced meditators decrease activity in their default mode network as compared to increasing activity when somebody is worrying. So this suggests there's a direct, these mechanistic mediators of changes in experience, like meditation, may directly affect these brain regions that are involved in getting caught up in worry. So that, from a scientific standpoint, maybe you're interested in that, maybe you're not. That's fine, because now we're going to get into the pragmatics. This is what one of my old mentors used to call the "who cares" question. So when I would go up to him with experiment that I wanted to do. He was a practicing psychiatrist. He would give me a big smile and he'd go, "So what?" So he really taught me to keep all of this stuff very, very relevant. And I have to say, also as a practicing psychiatrist, to me, this is really important because you can do a bunch of neuroscience, but if it doesn't, at the end of the day, change how we practice psychiatry and also doesn't help people, then it's less exciting. So over the last decade or so, we have discovered through what are called mixed methods research, where we interview people and we look at their qualitative experience, but also look at the quantitative changes, for example, in their GAD-7 scores. What we started to notice was that there are these 3 steps of habit change, and this applies not just to anxiety, but also to stress eating, to smoking, and other habits as well. So step one, I'll just list them and then I'm going to go through them specifically. So first step is becoming aware of being caught up in a habit loop. Second step is exploring the results of that behavior. And the third step is, of course, stepping out. So how do we do this? I'll give an example, going back to my patient with first, how do we recognize a habit loop? So when somebody comes into my clinic, I take their medical history, I get the full social history and all of that. And then I start listening to see where they might be forming habits around anxiety. And what I'll do is give them a 30-second psychoeducation piece where I talk about how anxiety habits form. Now, I'm going to show you the actual paper that I used because my patient took a picture of it and saved it, and he sent it to me a couple of years after we started treatment together. This is the actual paper. And I should warn you, they don't let us graduate from medical school until you can't read our handwriting anymore. So if you can't read this, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So I happened to have a 4x6 notepad of sticky notes in my office that day. And so I started mapping out his anxiety triggers so that his worry that he might get in a car accident, his behavior was that he was worrying that he was getting in a car accident because he would think, oh no, I might get a panic attack while driving. And then the result was that he would avoid driving on the highway. And so I gave him some resources, like I've got a bunch of free resources on my Dr. Judd website. So you can see I wrote that up there and gave him some things to look into. And then also you can see Wednesday at 12. I run a live clinical group for Zoom for anybody in any of our programs. And so I said, you can join our live group and it's like a group medical visit. So that was what I sent him home to do, was just to start mapping out his habit loops. And I said, okay, let's follow up in 2 weeks. So the first step's actually pretty easy, pretty straightforward. And if you're interested, we actually have a free habit mapper. It's just the URL is mapmyhabit.com. You can go there, download the PDF, and start mapping out any of your habit loops. It's completely free. Or go to the Dr. Judd website. It's also there as well. So, if you look at my patient, what his aim was to start mapping out these panic attacks leading to avoiding driving, and then what he would get from that. So that's the first step. The second step, I think of this as the beginning of the end. And I say this because there's a part of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that is involved in determining how rewarding a behavior is. I'll give you a real world example from this guy. So let's say that I eat some broccoli and I eat some milk chocolate. And my brain's going to compare those two. And from a caloric standpoint, milk chocolate is much more rewarding than broccoli because it has more calories, it's more calorically dense. So my brain's going to set up this reward hierarchy that says, okay, milk chocolate, given a choice, eat the milk chocolate before the broccoli. Now, when I then eat dark chocolate, my brain's going to compare that. And of course, for me, it's definitely dark. And you can see how we set up these reward hierarchies and that this is really critical for how this reinforcement learning process happens. I won't go into all of the math here, but what I have people do in my clinic is just start to ask this simple question. What am I getting from this? And the reason I have them ask this question is because often people get stuck in this let's just say it's not real idea that willpower is going to save the day. If it had saved the day, they wouldn't be coming to see me. And so instead of trying to think themselves out of doing whatever the behavior is, whether it's overeating or worrying, I just have them, if they're going to do it anyway, I have them go ahead and do it, but pay attention and see what the result is. And we sum that all up in asking this question, what am I getting from this? And I'll give you an example of how somebody mapped this out themselves. So here was somebody who reported in one of our programs, I woke up with a bit of anxiety over what had happened the night before, but instead of giving into it, I got curious about how that felt as well. This alone seemed to bring anxiety down a notch. So then I asked myself the disenchantment question on both sides of the coin. What did I get out of being anxious over these body sensations? Nothing but more anxious, to be quite honest. And so this is a key finding, and this is something that I see over and over and over in our Going Beyond Anxiety program, is that people they think anxiety is helpful at first. When they really pay attention and just get curious about what that anxiety is doing for them, they realize it's it's not doing much, if anything. So just bring it back to my patient. I had to map out his anxiety habit loops. What I didn't tell you was that my patient also had health anxiety. And why did he have health anxiety? Well, he was 400 pounds when he came to see me. He had obstructive sleep apnea. He had basically had pated his liver by eating so much fast food. And then he also had hypertension, all of these related to his very unhealthy weight. And so when he came back to me 2 weeks after our first visit, the first thing he said to me, he looked less anxious, which was great. But the first thing he said to me was, "Hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds." And I looked at him curiously because I didn't think we had talked about weight loss yet. We were going to save that for later. But he said, yeah, we didn't talk about weight loss. But I was mapping out my anxiety habit loops, and I realized that I eat fast food as a way to avoid those feelings of anxiety. And so this is what his habit loop looked like. So he said, I get anxious, I eat fast food, and he literally said, I'm addicted to fast food. I describe him in my Unwinding Anxiety book as Dave. But what he also highlighted was that he said, eating this fast food is making me more anxious. So it's not actually very rewarding. And he said, so I just stopped doing it. I was just, he became very disenchanted with it because he saw it wasn't helping. And in fact, it was making things worse. So this is Dave, this is one patient who did, lost 14 pounds in a couple of weeks. But how does this actually work at a population level? It's very easy for a psychiatrist to think we're doing a great job because patients come in and tell us we're doing a great job. There also can be a lot of social pressure, a lot of other things that can get in the way of finding out the truth. So this is where I put my neuroscience hat on and I said, let's do the studies. So we did a study with our app-based mindfulness training program for eating, where we basically have walk people through an exercise of paying attention as they overeat. And what we found was this is people who'd been overeating for decades, some of them for decades, where when they start really dialing into that reward value, it drops below zero relatively quickly. It doesn't take very much time to do that because our brain figures things out quickly when we pay attention. It's tremendously plastic. It's set up so that we can adapt to an ever-changing environment. But the key here is that we have to pay attention. It's not about thinking our way out of a behavior. It's about paying attention and seeing how curiosity can show us everything that we need to do. So I won't go into so that's the crux of it with the second step, or we call this second year in our program. The idea is just helping people pay attention to the results of the behavior, leveraging that reinforcement learning mechanism on top of itself so that they can start to become disenchanted with their old habits. Now, once people become disenchanted, their brain's going to say, okay, well, that's not so great. Can you give me something better? And this is where step 3 or third year comes in. And the idea is if we really know that this reinforcement learning process is very strong, right? And I'll just give you some examples of how we can drive these behaviors. How can we actually bring in a substitute behavior that's not just going to drive the process itself? So people distracting themselves with social media, et cetera, telling themselves not to worry. These are all things that tend not to work so well and not consistently. So here we're going to go back to Einstein, apparently he said, I have no special talents, I'm only passionately curious. And what if we started substituting curiosity in for worrying? So for all of you listening or watching right now, just ask yourself, which one feels better, worrying or being curious about something? So in a study, I won't show you the results, but we did a study of several hundred people, and we found that very consistently, people reported that curiosity feels better than worrying. That's also what I hear clinically from my patients over and over and over. So we can imagine when we have a feeling of anxiety, that's this negative emotion here, We could worry, which just drives the behavior more, or we could get curious. Oh, what does this feel like in my body? So instead of going, oh no, and worrying that we might be anxious all day or trying to come up with a way to make our anxiety go away, just shifting that, oh no, to oh, can really open up the possibilities. And part of the possibility here is just simply being with our experience rather than running away from it or pushing against it. And I love this phrase, the only way out is through. So often our brains are evolutionarily set up to make unpleasant things go away. So it's natural for us to want to run away from our anxiety. Yet running away tires us out, and it also fuels the anxiety. It says, oh, they're running, I can run after them. So instead of running away, what if we run toward our experience? Well, several things happen. One is that the fear gets afraid. It says, oh, they're on to me, because we start to realize that these sensations are simply sensations that we can be with. They come and go on there, and we don't have to do anything to make them go away. Another one of my favorite phrases that I learned in my psychiatry training is what we resist persists. So if we fight our feelings of anxiety, oh no, I've got to fight this, they're just going to persist. Well, if we turn toward them and open to them, we go, oh, we welcome them, then they just kind of come and go on their own, and we realize they're not as big a deal as we thought. All right, I'm going to give you an example of what this actually looks like. So the person that I mentioned earlier, they woke up with anxiety. They realized that they were getting more anxious in that second step or second gear. So they continued. What did I get out of being curious about my sensations and the anxiety I was feeling? A highly lessened state of anxiety, which allowed me to comfortably drift off to sleep. So notice how this curiosity became their superpower, where they leaned in and turned toward their experience instead of running away or feeding the anxiety. It goes away on its own. And in a study I didn't show you, we can actually see a huge reduction in worry that prevents people from sleeping with these types of programs. I'll give one more example, and then we'll just mention one more thing and then open it up for questions. Somebody with panic said, when I had full-blown panic attacks, looking inside made it just melt away. I was looking at what I was feeling instead of obsessing over why I was feeling it. I don't know how many folks can relate to this. Why, I call this the why habit loop. It is very prevalent. And I also wrote a Substack article on this for people to start to experiment with, what they get from the why habit loop and how they can work with it. So one last thing I want to mention, because this is very much in the zeitgeist, is AI. Okay. Now, there are many, many ways to think about AI, but one of them is to just ask the simple question, how are people actually using what's called generative AI, these conversational agents today? So number one use in 2025, up from number 2 last year, is therapy and companionship. So people are already using out-of-the-box conversational agents for therapy. So as I dug into this space, okay, people are using this. One of the big problems that's been identified with these conversational agents is what's called syncopathy, or sycophancy, I think is a better term for this. So sycophancy is basically telling people what they want to hear. And why am I mentioning this? Well, this can lead to all sorts of not helpful stuff where the bot is basically just reinforcing people's beliefs. I love some of these examples. This is from a New York Times article. You can see this here. You just beat quantum, So that's brilliant, Alien. Seriously brilliant. You've done the impossible. So of course, if we go to a chatbot and it's just telling us that we are great, this can lead to all sorts of problems. So as I looked into this even further, I learned how these are trained and how this came about. It's called reinforcement learning with human feedback. Yes, you heard me correctly. Reinforcement learning is the strongest way that humans learn. So the humans said, well, let's take this learning process and develop these deep neural networks to train the bots. And the reinforcement learning itself worked pretty well, but it wasn't perfect. And then they started incorporating this human feedback where humans would basically rate the bots' answers. And this is where the magic happened, where these things sounded very, very human-like. Now, there's a problem here, not only in sending people in delusional spirals, but tragically, we've seen cases where this has even led to loss of life. And so I highlight this because this is critical that we have guardrails if we're going to be using these conversational agents. So just wanted, let's all take a collective deep breath here, because this can seem very, very distressing in many ways. So I'm going to just share a story that just happened to me a week ago. I was flying out to Los Angeles to be part of a conference and give a talk. And I was sitting next to a young woman flying from Boston, and we took off, pretty uneventful flight. But she seemed pretty nervous on the takeoff. She was shaking. She turned on the seat back meditation and did some guided meditation for a little bit. Seemed to calm down. Rest of the flight went relatively well. Now, we started descending into LA. We were going through the clouds, no big deal. And then, we're slowing down. You can tell we're about to land. And suddenly our plane takes this huge angle upward and just takes off. It's like the pilot floored it. And this young woman next to me, she crosses herself, bursts into tears, grabs her seat, looks at me and goes, "I'm really afraid." Now, I've been trying not to get all up in her business during the flight, as a psychiatrist, but I was like, okay, permission to engage. So I taught her this practice called 5-finger breathing. You can find it on the Dr. Judd website, but basically it's a technique that's actually used mostly for children, but it works very well for adults to help somebody ground in the present moment. So I taught this to her. She did it religiously for the rest of the flight. We landed, and then she turned to me and said, "Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were sitting next to me." Well, it's fortunate that we were sitting next to each other and I could be of service. But the key here made me start thinking like, well, what about all the other people on the flight? Wouldn't it be great if somebody could have kind of a doc in their pocket? And so what we've been exploring in a collaboration between my lab and a startup company is how can we actually take my clinic into the 21st century? So, I can do one-on-one treatment with patients, but that doesn't scale. We have also developed digital therapeutics, but they're shiny and the content that they deliver is very static. Well, what can we do? So we can actually take a podcast style didactics. So think of the thing that I do at the beginning of every intake is where I explain how a habit loop works to a patient. Well, I can explain that once and have that produced so that people get it right away and also can come back to that lesson. The other thing we can do there is we can have daily practices and then live weekly groups. That's also scalable. But the thing that's really gotten us excited is that we can actually start to add in and leverage these digital therapeutics, these conversational agents, because we can guardrail them. Instead of training them on the entirety of the internet, we can say you are trained specifically on this and you are to focus on this only. And we can also embed a lot of safety guardrails. So we have started testing out teaching assistants where the teaching assistants go back and quiz people on their understanding. So we do check and comprehension. We can also do experiential education. And I'll give you an example. This really surprised me. This just happened last week. Somebody wrote me a note saying, "I was surprised by this. I had this insightful experience with the Dr. Judd bot. I'm somewhat averse to AI, so I was trying to simply bring a willingness and curiosity to my experience." Again, curiosity is key. "I had much of the same positive experiences of understanding the gears more clearly after having to explain or teach the bot what each meant," right? Because it says, "Tell me how you understand this." And then applying them to my chosen habit loop. That's the experiential education piece. There was a way that this interaction slowed things down for me enough so that I was able to feel more deeply the results. It felt strange to type that the bot helped me to feel more deeply, right? So here it is. You think of AI being very impersonal, but if we guardrail it and use it in a specific way, it might be able to be helpful. So that's just something that we're exploring in our Going Beyond Anxiety program. So I just want to finish up so we can open it up to questions. So how did my patient with anxiety do? Obviously, if he didn't do well, I probably wouldn't use him as an example, but here we are. So Dave, full-blown anxiety, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, had, his very unhealthy weight, had health anxiety. So I mentioned that he lost 14 pounds after 2 weeks of using the treatment that I was providing. So after about a year, he went on to lose over 100 pounds. He has not regained that weight. That was probably about 8 years ago now, and said it was the easiest weight loss he's ever had. More importantly, about 6 months into treatment, again, this is somebody who has panic attacks when driving. I'm walking out of our School of Public Health at Brown University, which is on Main Street, very busy street, and all the streets in Providence are pretty narrow. This car pulls up, pulls over, guy rolls down his window, and I'm thinking, oh, great, it's Dave. And he gives me this big grin and goes, hey, doc, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm headed to the airport to pick someone up. So I just want to finish by saying, even if it's really, really severe anxiety, if we learn how our mind works, we can learn to work with our mind. So I'll end with this quote. I love this quote from Rumi. It says, be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. So I just want to thank especially the research participants in our studies, but all the folks that have contributed to this research over the years, and our funders, including most of our work was funded by the NIH, but also some private foundations. And I just leave you with this: 3 steps. You can play with this yourself, whether it's anxiety or any other habit. You got to start with knowing how your brain works. You got to learn to work with your brain, and then you can put your brain to work for you. So if you're interested in learning more, we got a bunch of free resources on my website. We have this Going Beyond Anxiety program. You can check that out if you know somebody with anxiety, or if you just want to get informed on the latest neuroscience. I have a weekly newsletter, a free weekly newsletter that goes out via Substack, and you can find that here. So I will end there. We've got a couple of minutes for questions,
Do it.
and I would be happy to open it up.
Thank you so much. So many pages of notes here, such great information, also covered in these excellent books and online. So I'm the parent of a teenager. I suffer from some anxiety myself. I've been enlightened. I've learned today about know how your brain works. I've learned about the points of working with my brain, putting my brain to work. I'm going to relearn and re-lean in. I'm discovered now how a habit loop works. Now I'm going to put some daily practice. I'm going to be curious about what I'm getting out of this so I can break these habits. Now I want to sit down with my teen and I want to teach them about trigger, behavior, result. I'm not going to have a lot of time with my kid. They're going to give me, this.
Yes.
All right. But help me now. What's the dialogue I'm going to have with my child when my child walks, when my child comes in the door, or after I'm listening to this, help me teach them in a way that you think a teen brain would walk away with some real life skills.
Yeah. So you're raising something that is so important. One is, have you heard the saying, a prophet is not welcome in their own town? Yes. So parents of the prophets, and their hometown is their house, right? So as you know, and anybody with a teen knows, the last person they want to listen to is mom, is their parents or their caretakers. So this is really, so first off, it starts with knowing that we have this really strong, urge to help our kid. And that urge can actually backfire. The more we push, the more they push, right? And so it starts with, and we're actually starting to pilot test out basically a family program where we have parents go through the Going Beyond Anxiety program so they can, even if they don't have a lot of anxiety, they can really learn this, but most importantly, they can live it. So when the parent lives it and their kid sees that they're living it, they're like, yeah, mom's chill. I'm anxious. Maybe I'll ask mom about being chill. Whereas if mom's not so chill and then mom says, I'm going to tell you how to be chill, you think the kid's going to listen? No way. They're like, mom, why should I listen to you? You are anxious all the time. You worry, you distract yourself on social media. So that's the first place to start, is like really learning and embodying this ourselves. The second place that we're starting to explore this is, I think for a lot of parents, we're finding they love the Going Beyond Anxiety program because there's a group element where they can feel heard, they can relate to each other and all of that. And then also we can have direct interactions. we're learning that teenagers are more comfortable. I just saw a survey on this. 55%, so more than half, I think, feel more comfortable talking to a confidential chatbot than to a parent or an adult. And I've heard, as we've been pilot testing and doing, experience, basically interviewing high school students, I've heard horror stories about, the school counselor telling other students about students, personal health information, stuff that they should get fired for. But like that's gonna scare any kid off from going to see a person. But the other thing is there's going to be an inherent power hierarchy, adult to kid. And so they often report that they feel judged, even if they're not, if the parent or the therapist is like the most non-judgmental person out there, just the dynamic is set up socially and societally to be like, okay, there's this hierarchy, and so it's hard for them. Whereas with these bots, no judgment, it's just a bot. So here we're exploring how to like have the teens go right in through a digital assistant, not ChatGPT. I'm not suggesting that. But those are ways that we can start to leverage like the best way to help. So getting back to your question, in our family program that we're just starting to pilot test, it's really about helping the whole family. And whether it's just the education for the parents, if they're not anxious, or if the parent is anxious, helping them, and then them being able to live it, and then having the student come to them or give the student a resource that they're very comfortable with, like technology.
So you were in the airplane and you did the 5 fingers. Do the 5 fingers with someone who might not be aware of it.
Yeah, sure. So the idea is you take an index finger, put it at the base of your pinky. We can all do this together. And as we breathe in, we're going to pay attention to 4 things. We're going to pay attention to the physical sensations on both our hands. We're going to be looking at our hands. We're going to be feeling our breath because we have to know that we're breathing in. So we breathe in and we trace up. We pause at the top, and then as we breathe out, we trace down. And then as we breathe in, we trace up. The ring finger, as we breathe out, we trace down. We do one more. As we breathe in, we trace up. As we breathe out, we trace down. So you can imagine over the course of 5 breaths, what we're doing is, well, I don't know. Tell me, did you notice any difference just in 3 breaths?
No question.
Yeah. So what's happening there? 1, we're grounding our nervous system. We're grounding our physiology. 2, we're creating we're clearing out our cache for our working memory. You can only hold about 4 things at once in your working memory. So we're clearing out that worry and anxiety cache and then letting that reboot. When it reboots, our physiology and our body feels more grounded. And so when those worry thoughts come in, there's a mismatch. And our brain is saying, oh, I'm worried. And our body says, I'm not feeling it. It's much easier to notice those thoughts and let them go. So it's a great grounding practice to get that prefrontal cortex back online and also help us see how powerful it is to be able to just notice our thoughts and watch them and let them go. I love it. It's one of my favorites.
I love it too. So we're going to go back to the original question. I'm so anxious. It's not the right word, but I'm so eager. I'm eager.
Yeah.
Eager to help this child in front of me, grade school, 10-year-old, whatever. I have been enlightened with this talk, and now I'm really eager to share something. I'm not, what can I do now in this moment? What's my takeaway as a parent with my child about what you've shared today?
I think the one word answer is curiosity. Like, discover the superpower of curiosity. In fact, I don't know if y'all can see this. This is why I have this poster in the back of my office. Oh, it's a reminder to my students, my postdocs, myself, how powerful curiosity is. So if we remember nothing else, just notice how powerful curiosity is. It truly is a superpower. If we were to get if you want more than one word, it's like really understand how habit loops form, start mapping out all the habits that we have, and then know that we can actually leverage our brain, and that critically, it's not about willpower, right? There's a great skit by Bob Newhart from the 1970s called Stop It. So if anybody wants some comic relief, he was highlighting this back in the 70s, when cognitive behavioral therapy was on its upswing and people were like, oh, CBT. He's like, wait a minute, there's something here that's not quite right. And it took several decades for neuroscience to figure out what that was. So, and I won't ruin the punchline for it. Great 5 minute skit, totally worth the watch. But the idea is this is where leaning in and seeing what we're getting from the behavior, that's the what am I getting from this question? That is critical. We can't skip that step. And curiosity is the key for that as well. Getting curious, like, oh, what am I getting from this instead of judging ourselves?
You know, and we hear this so much from all of our speakers about in the moment of heated argument, leaning into being curious, non-judgmental. So really, instead of your big O, maybe another one that says curious all the time.
I love it. I'll have to get one of those for sure.
Dr. Hill, do you have a question?
Yeah, Dr. Brewer and Gilda, I don't know if it's going to help you or not, Gilda, with your question. We have seen a steady increase in emotional deregulation of children. We're a pre-K 8 district since COVID.
Yeah.
Also a pretty significant increase in suicide ideology. And what we started doing 3.5 years ago, I don't know if you've ever heard of flipping a lid curriculum,
No.
where
Oh.
we're teaching our children about the prefrontal cortex, or as it's called in the curriculum, the wise owl, and the hippocampus, or the memory elephant,
Yeah.
and the amygdala, the guard dog. Teaching kids using their hands how they're feeling and how to help regulate some of their emotionality. We teach them breathing too, not the 5 finger, which I like that one too, but we teach them to help try to self-regulate themselves. And we found that to be very helpful, especially our younger children, second grade through fifth, when they feel like they are in a situation in which they are losing their ability to regulate, that we're teaching them strategies that kind of help them get back to where they need to be. We share that with our parents and our community to kind of help them reinforce that at home. But a child can't learn if they're not focused on learning. If they're focused on something else, we try to help them with that.
Bless you. You are teaching them distress tolerance, and that is a critical skill that everyone is losing. So thank you for mentioning that. And thank you for that work. That is so critical.
I have a question. When you finish a presentation like this, is there one common question that always comes to you when you go, oh, there it is again. There it is again.
There are several, and I'll leave it at one or maybe two. So one of the top ones that I get is that isn't my anxiety helpful for me performing or making it through the day, right? There's this whole myth around performance anxiety. I write about it in the Unwriting Anxiety book, where this came from a 1908 study of Japanese dancing mice. I kid you not.
Wow.
Right. So people, I won't go into the details, but people basically extrapolated, where there's this inverted U-shaped curve for a certain amount of arousal, which is different than anxiety, right? Anxiety can be pretty arousing, but it's different than arousal in a Japanese dancing mouse, just saying. And so they extrapolated like, oh, well, then there must be this thing for humans where there's an optimal level of anxiety. The optimal level of anxiety is 0. It's an inverse relationship. And that's been shown over and over, a number of studies showing the more anxious we are, the worse we perform. If you looked at optimal performance, it's about flow. When we're so immersed in what we're doing, we completely lose a sense of ourself. And if there's no you, how can you be anxious, right? So there's more evidence suggesting that I don't think you need to go beyond the Japanese dancing mice, but if somebody's, I get that, I get page-long emails where people are defending their anxiety, and it's like, well, that's how deeply ingrained these habits can be. So the key is really to be open to explore and ask, is it really helping? Is it really helping? And the other thing is the correlation does not equal causation. So if somebody's anxious all day, and they perform well, it doesn't mean that because they were anxious, they perform well. They just happen to be anxious all day. And so they're going to make that correlation. That's a false association.
And the last question, is there a mistake that you see often occurring as people go to this model and then you go, oh, there it is again. There's that mistake again.
Boy, these are such great questions. The mistake is where we call this the first to third gear face plant. Yeah. So it's easy to map out a habit loop around anxiety or anything else, stress eating, procrastination. That's actually pretty straightforward. People get that pretty well. A minor mistake that people make is that they focus on the triggers, and the triggers are the least important part of the equation. So triggers are not what reinforce the behavior, it's how rewarding it is. So it's critical. Don't waste your time on a trigger, which is good news. Just then we don't have to like move out of town or avoid all the things that cause that trigger it. It's just that's what sets it in motion. The key is how rewarding something is. So that's a minor mistake. So the first to third gear face plant is when somebody maps out a habit loop and then they say, okay, I can see it. Now we just have to stop it. Right. And this is where stop it comes in. They try to use their willpower. They try to use these things without actually checking to see what they're getting from the behavior. If they don't become disenchanted with the behavior, they're going to keep perpetuating it. It's going to be insidious. It's going to be in the background. It's going to come back when when their willpower is depleted, so to speak. And so that's the key is it's not willpower. It's leveraging reinforcement learning, full stop.
Perfect. What are you actually getting from the behavior? Leveraging that enforcement behavior. Say that again. Say that one more time. So
yeah,
I can write.
It's not about willpower.
Not about
it's
willpower.
about leveraging reinforcement learning, right? And so we become disenchanted with the worry, and then we become enchanted with curiosity. Wouldn't it be amazing if if everyone led with curiosity instead of judgment, right? Wouldn't it be amazing if everyone led with kindness, instead of divisiveness or I'm right or me or me? Just see how it would transform the world. Instead of like assuming somebody's has ill intent, we get curious. Oh, let me understand your perspective, right? Oh, imagine in school if kids were actually curious. I'm just, like.
No, that's our goal. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That is it. Yeah. Leveraging that reinforcement learning. You're right. And I think when you talk about kindness, I think, why is it so hard? It shouldn't be that hard.
It's not. I think that it's not reinforced, right? So it's there, but and I think there are a lot of people that are good at helping to point out like, oh, what was it like when somebody held the door for you? What was it like? So there are places that we can see it, but if we don't know how that mechanism actually works, that we replace judgment with kindness, including for ourselves. Oh man, I see this with teens all the time. They judge themselves, right? And they think that the judgment is going to help because they see it in the movies. The hero is hard on themselves, and then of course in the movies that it always has a happy ending. Well, that's not how real life works. If we're judging ourselves, we're doing two things. One is it feels like it's better than doing nothing, right? Because the thing that we did that we're judging ourselves over is already in the past. We can't change the past, right? I love this quote attributed to Lily Tomlin. Forgiveness is giving up hope of a better past. Isn't that great? So the idea is the past is the past, but the present is where we can actually act. And so we can judge ourselves or we can ask, what do I get from judgment, right? It just closes us down into a fixed mindset. Talk about Carol Dweck's work, right? So when we're a fixed mindset, we can't actually learn. So if we did something that didn't go well, we're not going to learn from that if we're beating ourselves up. So instead of that, we can be kind to ourselves and go, oh, that didn't go so well. And that puts us in a growth mindset so we can actually lean in and learn. I call this, I keep saying Substack, but I put all these out there so I don't have to keep, like all the resources are out there. I put a Substack out there called the FGO, the freaking growth opportunity.
That's good.
That's for my wife. She had an R-rated version of that as well.
Yes.
But so the idea there is if we can notice that we're judging ourselves, we can then step back from that, see that it doesn't help, and then we can open to the experience and see it as a teacher, to bow to it as a teacher. That is so powerful. And then I'll put out there, is there ever such a thing as 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, if we learn more from tripping up than when things go well? That's a good koan for people to chew on.
Okay, as I'm saying goodbye, replace the judgment with kindness. We're going to lean in and learn. And I think about the teachers and the parents and the school staff that are listening to this. Really, 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 really powerful. Thank you. Thank you so much for this time. Just an honor.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.